welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth Series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, September 12th. It's also a great pleasure and honor to have with us today Professor Elizabeth Currid-Halkett, who is the Professor of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. She teaches courses in economic development and urban policy and planning. Her research focuses on the arts and culture, the American consumer economy, and the role of culture in geographic and class divides. She's also the author of several books, most recently this one, The Overlooked Americans, published last year in 2023, and a really interesting read, one that I found so enjoyable and so interesting that I had to reach out and see if we could have a conversation with her here on GNAT. And lo and behold, here we are. Professor Halkett, again, thank you very much for making the time for this conversation. Really looking
Thank you
forward
for
to it.
inviting me. The pleasure.
So I guess I'm just curious. Let's start with talking about the title. Who are the Overlooked Americans? And what prompted your interest in writing about them?
So for me, the overlooked Americans are the folks that kind of get ignored in our polls, right? So we're so focused on, super left, super right. If we're going to geographically if we're going to go into rural America, we're talking to people who are really angry and they feel left behind. And, this really came to a head with the 2016 presidential election, because after that, the story was, rural Americans are so angry. They voted for Trump as a protest vote. He understands them. This country is, doesn't pay attention to these people. And growing up in rural America, being born in West Virginia, I was raised in a small town in Pennsylvania. I didn't know these people that were so angry and felt so left behind, and were really, sticking it to the Democrats and the coastal elites by voting for Trump. I just didn't see that, and so I guess it's twofold. So the first is that I have personal experience with people who are not depicted in the media. And second, that I think the folks in this country that are overlooked are the ones just not making a lot of noise, but their opinions matter and their values matter. And, I'm kind of paraphrasing Barack Obama. He was in conversation with the novelist and writer Marilynne Robinson. And he said, people just aren't interested. I'm paraphrasing, but, people just aren't interested in those nice folks in Iowa who are just living their lives and figured out a way to get along. It's just not a news story. And so that's why I call them overlooked, because those are the people that I know from where I grew up, and those are the people I wanted to talk to more.
And why do you think they're overlooked? I mean, I would have thought if you had asked me this question, let's say 10, 15, 20 years ago, are people in Appalachia overlooked? Are people in, Iowa or wherever overlooked? I would have thought, well, not any more overlooked than anybody else is. Do you think this is a relatively recent phenomenon, or something that goes back much farther in our country's history?
That's a great question. I'm sure people might disagree with my response. I think it's somewhat recent in the sense that I think that the new narrative of this country is one of division. Now, it's not new as in 3 years ago, but it's new as in the last 10 years. I would argue that it's a conversation about, and I think this really, again, I'm not a political scientist, so I may be out of my wheelhouse here, but we think about, the rise of the Tea Party and that movement. And even though it kind of went away, that there was this movement of a much more conservative leaning and very loud right. And but the thing for me was that it didn't actually capture truly all conservative voters by any means. I mean, there's plenty of conservative voters who are not in any way like the Tea Party and folks that are super far right. And at the same time, as often happens, is that you have another thing going on in the left, which is these very left, very progressive voters, politicians, just people talking. And then the media has really changed too in the last decade. You've got an incredible emphasis on instant reactions, headlines that will be retweeted. Everything is in real time all the time and has to be amped up, amped up, amped up. So you're overlooked because you're not a news story. It's not a news story to say, yeah, they're still getting along. They're still nice people. The news story is, people saying outrageous things and trying to ban books and, storming the Capitol and all of that stuff, but it's not representative of most people in this country. And those people aren't being focused on.
Or is it the case that they're not speaking out in the first place? I mean, because it's very easy to kind of buy into that narrative that someone who lives in a rural small town, kind of, well, 80% of them vote for Trump or whatever. And that's just kind of the culture of the place. It would seem like if there's a substantial number of people who kind of are not fitting into that narrative, they would be more vocal, perhaps.
Well, actually, see, I disagree. I mean, one of the things that I realized, which really goes against the dominant narrative, which is that, these rural Americans who feel left behind are really angry, was that a lot of the rural Americans I talked to were just living their lives. I mean, they didn't need to be vocal. I actually didn't speak to anyone who felt some need to get their point across in the national news. They had their kids and their grandkids, and they lived on a farm, or they lived next to their neighbors. They just were having a life that they didn't feel needed to be broadcast.
Because one of the points in your book I thought was really quite interesting was the fact that quality of life in rural small towns is actually quite good, and a lot of those rural small towns are thriving and doing quite well, and people, as you just said, are living very happy lives, very contented lives, and that that's not a perception that we tend to hear much about.
Yeah, so I want to be careful. I'm a student of economic development and economic geography by trade. That's always going to come back to it. I am very interested in why certain places thrive and others decline. I don't think that all of rural America is doing great, but I'll caveat that with I don't think all of urban America is doing great. The point is it's very uneven. So, if you look at large parts of the Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, parts of the Northeast, you see thriving rural America. And then you look at parts of the South and parts of Appalachia, and you see real economic problems, economic and social problems, pathologies, joblessness. My point is that rural America is it's not a monolith, and the same thing about urban America. I mean, we think about like where I live in Los Angeles, like there is extraordinary affluence. And there are also neighborhoods filled with crime and poverty. We have a terrible situation with the unhoused in the city. They don't have a place to live. These things are happening in the same place. And I think that that's the problem, is this kind of rural America is doing badly is just not true for most of it. Yeah, but I also want to be careful because I think in terms of economic development and public policy, there are places that need real intervention. It's just probably not Iowa.
You touched upon a point I found quite interesting, and one that we've talked a bit about on the show several times, and that's this whole question of why do some communities thrive and others don't. I traveled around Vermont and talked to some of the community leaders in our state here. Some communities, when faced with adversity, let's say the big factory in town that employed hundreds of people closed, and now those folks were out of work. Some communities seem to find a way to kind of pick themselves up and move forward. Others just seem to be stuck in this, the past of, gee, somebody else will come along and buy the factory and it'll restart and we'll all go back to being happy again. But it just seems like there's some communities that are able to kind of move beyond a setback and go forward. Have you ever noticed any factors in play here to explain why some communities are able to kind of move on, and others just sort of stay stuck in a past?
Well, I'll actually start with my work on cities because that's where I first observed this. If you think about the decline of the manufacturing economy in the United States, which happened in the kind of 60s and 70s in the 20th century, what you saw was a huge exodus from all cities for the most part, particularly on the East Coast. And, most of us immediately think of the Rust Belt. You got Detroit, you've got parts of Ohio, you've got Pittsburgh, and parts of New York. A strange thing happened, though, in New York City, which also was a center for manufacturing, was that whilst it lost its manufacturing base, it gained in what we now call the knowledge economy, professional services, finance, law, medicine, kind of I'm being really wonky now, but what the sociologist Saskia Sassen called high level producer services, right? So in the world of ideas and knowledge rather than the world of things. Why was that? Why was New York able to do that? Because New York already had a diverse economy. So it wasn't a one horse town. It was a town where when manufacturing left, it had other industries that were able to uphold its economy. So I think what happens, I think it's the same phenomenon when you look at smaller towns, that if it's a town that has a somewhat diverse base, an ability to diversify its economy, that if mining shuts down or agriculture slows or a manufacturing plant shuts down, that if it has something else going on, that can replace and also attract other firms and industries. Now, an aspect of this is education levels. So I really do believe that not everyone needs a college degree. We have a lot of really important jobs, trade jobs, that don't mean you need a BA in anything, right? But you do need some people with a bachelor's degree because that's how you draw in particular kinds of firms, particular kinds of jobs that are higher paying. And that then brings a kind of ecosystem with it. So I think the difference often in a place thriving or recovering from economic decline is its resilience of a kind of a base level economy.
Mhm. And community leadership also seems to be a big factor in that too. If you have like a town or city manager who's capable of thinking outside the box a little bit, or a business community that's prepared to kind of move forward, those seem to be factors as well. That there needs to be a spark plug someplace.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to refer to an urban example, but way back in the 1960s and 70s, Los Angeles had more engineers than the Bay Area in San Francisco and its environs. You wouldn't think that, right? But of course, it does have this long history of aerospace as JPL, Caltech, and so forth. So there was this real history. And this is my colleague Michael Storper's work. What he found was that one of the reasons the Bay Area ultimately thrived as a technological hub was there was a spirit of entrepreneurship and openness and a desire for innovation, and that success and failure were kind of hand in hand. That was a whole culture and vision of leadership and how that leadership shaped the culture and the people who work there that really put Silicon Valley on the map. And so I think that your point about how do leaders shape and build up a community is really, we know that to be true. We know that can cut both ways. Like you can have community leaders who really have a vision and others who are very wary, and they can be wary for good reason, but they will be wary of partnerships or firms coming in. And so it really does take an openness often along with the kind of tangible stuff.
Um, so do you see a pathway emerging out of this sort of division that we're all seeing, particularly this election year, the polarization between left and right, between coastal elites and folks in the heartland and all that. Is there a way, do you think, where we could, if we wanted to, kind of break out of the bubbles that we seem to be drifting into, where these perceptions of what people are like in other parts of the country are what they are, but they don't really, they're not really accurate. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people who, I used to live in Brooklyn. There are a lot of people there probably think of people who live in Appalachia as a collection of hillbillies.
Mm.
And people in Appalachia probably think of my neighbors in my old neighborhood in Brooklyn as a bunch of coastal elites that think they're smarter than everybody else. And neither perception is accurate, I don't think.
Yeah.
But how do we get out of that?
I have a few ideas. I think the first thing, and it's really like it's almost got to be like a collective consciousness to stop attributing our vote to our person. I mean, we vote, and I've always argued that, look, this is a binary system. You get one vote. Okay, sure, some people vote for the Green Party. Somebody might vote for, if he was still in, Kennedy, Robert Kennedy. But in reality, most people vote either for the Democrat or the Republican. But we ascribe so much emotion to that vote. We know for a fact that rural America, for example, has been voting more conservative with every election. And yet, for some reason, in 2016 and 2020, and probably in 2024, we will assume that every person in rural America who votes for Trump, it's like a really loaded statement, when they might just be Republican. They may just not like the Democratic agenda. They may not even like Trump. I don't know. But they're like, well, I'm a Republican. Look, I'm talking out of turn with my dad. My dad is a Republican. And I was like, who are you going to vote for? He's like, well, this is really tough. I'm probably going to vote for all the Republicans and probably abstain from the presidential election from voting for the president. Because he's a Republican. He's conservative. Doesn't mean he's crazy about Trump. So my point being that I think there's this we have to stop this, this idea that our vote and our person are the same thing and we are judged by that. The second thing is, I think there's a lot of misinformation, and I see this on both sides. You know, in the morning when some event has happened, some political event has happened, my go-to is always the New York Times. Then I go to the Wall Street Journal. And then for fun, I go to the New York Post or Fox News, because what's going on? How are they interpreting the same event? And honestly, it's like you're in three different realities. I mean, the Journal and the New York Times are pretty aligned, but when you go to Fox News, it really doesn't tell the same story if it decides to report on the story at all sometimes. So my view is a lot of people are getting their news from YouTube or Facebook. Why? It's expensive to get high quality journalism. The Atlantic gives you, I don't know, a handful of free articles. The New York Times, the same thing. Wall Street Journal, Washington Post doesn't give you any, as last I checked. These are the best journalists. It's the best news. If we want people to be informed citizens, we have to make it a little less expensive. Now, I don't have the solution for how to do that, but my dream is that there's some organization that buys tons and tons of subscriptions. And if you want to, you can go to their website and you can read the best of the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and be informed with real journalism, not misinformation. So that's another thing. The other thing, which is something I also get tripped up on, I'm a Democrat, I'm very lefty, is this idea that our values are the values. I know what I care about. And there's this part of me that's like, I don't understand why they don't care about these things. Somebody who's different from me. Why doesn't my friend in Kentucky care strongly about climate change? I find it very stressful. Why doesn't this person champion marriage equality? I think it's one of the most important things that we have, and we need to fight for it constantly. And yet, I think someone else might say, but my religion is the most important thing. Why don't you care about that? And the thing is, I think we have to respect the idea that it's not that we even reject the values of another person, but that we have to understand that they might be different from ours, and that that's also okay.
One of the aspects of your book I really enjoyed a lot was the descriptions that you had of some of the people you did interviews with, like like Shannon, the lady
Yeah,
from Kentucky, I think,
yeah, Shannon
who
from
was
Kentucky.
polar opposite from you politically and everything, but you apparently struck up a very
Yeah,
friendly relationship with, despite the fact that you didn't agree on anything.
yeah.
I,
Well, that's actually kind of, she's a really good personal example of that point, which is I remember I would interview her. She was somebody I spoke to many, many times. And even though honestly, like on paper, like we were just so different. And it wasn't my job as an interviewer to try to convince her of anything. But I would find well, the one thing I really was trying to convince her to do was get a COVID vaccine because I really didn't want her to get sick. Um, but I realized I really enjoyed talking to her every day and that I spoke to her. And what struck me was here I have been put in this position by virtue of my research to get close to someone who's very different from me and to appreciate that they're very different from me and I still like them. And that actually should be a mantra for life, that is totally like how we should be approaching things, not they're different, ergo I don't like them.
um, sort of continuing a bit on that, or maybe pivoting slightly from that. One of the things that I've been struck by over the last couple of years, especially, and increasingly so this year during presidential election year, is this idea of grievance that many rural or red state voters seem to have, that they've been, well, to use your word, overlooked. That when the sort of the bedrocks of the economies that underlie their communities kind of began to shift and change or disappear, there was a lot of anger around that, and understandably so. But I guess I just wonder, do you feel like this sense of grievance, if indeed that's a fair characterization of the mindset, do you feel like there's any movement happening to say, well, we have to kind of move on and adapt to the world as it is today, rather than, grieving a past that is not coming back?
So here's the thing. I don't doubt that those people exist. There's plenty of books written on people who have grievances and anger um, towards what I would call as a kind of cultural and economic hegemony that resides in our cities and our coasts. Um, that said, I didn't hear a lot of that. What I will say, and by the way, I spoke to people in incredibly impoverished parts of this country. Grievance is just not a word I would use to describe any of them. Again, I think those people exist. I just didn't talk to them. But what I will say is I think something that people do feel frustrated by in rural America is that their culture and that their values are not deemed important. So it's not so much like a terrible anger, but it's a frustration that values they hold dear are not an important part of the national conversation, and that they're whipped into some sort of stereotype. So if that would be what I would say I learned from people, not anger, but just like we're not all a bunch of hillbillies, or kind of why do there's this wonderful man I met. He was a farmer in the Midwest, and he said, "Look, I struggle with marriage equality." And and he said he didn't say he was not homophobic. He didn't say he was against gay marriage. He said none of those things. I struggle with it because of my relationship to the scripture. It is tough for me. I'm figuring it out. I've been thinking a lot about it, talking about it with my wife. Um, I just don't know why I always have to be kind of dragged into those conversations. Like I'm not why I mean it's just not why do I and I really respected that. He wasn't coming from a place of hate. He was just saying, I'm just working through this and I don't need to be kind of forced to think something right now as I work through this. I really respected that honesty and also the fact that he took it so seriously.
But I struggle with the idea that this seems like a relatively new phenomenon in a way, but I guess I just wonder, 200 or 250 years ago when the country was started, there must have been a similar dynamic in play between people who lived in the larger towns of colonial America versus those who lived out, in more rural areas. It's hard to think that that wasn't the case also, and I guess I just wondered, is that your feeling as well, or is this is something that really is a much more recent phenomenon that is just different from what might have been in the past?
An excellent question. I don't have the answer for you. What I think makes it, I mean, obviously there's always divisions. I mean, that that's a given. I think what makes this moment in time quite acute is the way in which information is distributed and the way in which we learn about it. So I think the rise of 24/7 cable, 24/7 just news in general, social media, it's it's really constantly in your face. And the pressures of media to generate new content that is interesting also, I would argue, puts an emphasis on creating kind of much more sensational news and and amplifying differences and amplifying stories about division is a really good way to do that.
And that's a subject we've discussed here many times on some of our shows, is the evolution of the media. In fact, we just had a program last week. We talked about this fairly extensively. And I guess I just find myself wondering, as someone who's watched news reporting go from copy and paste to digital. I mean, where is this all supposed to lead to? I mean, on the one hand, there's a lot of benefits. People get information much more quickly, but as you've also already pointed out, sometimes the accuracy is less than ideal, and I just find myself very concerned about where the trend line seems to be going around particularly the social media area, which also impacts the ability of small local papers to carry out what historically was their job, which was to report what was going on in the local community, and to provide accountability for local government, and be a sounding board for people to write letters to the editor and express their opinions. All of that seems to be vastly less robust, to put it kindly, than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
Well, I agree, and I do wonder if the public, there's a growing sense of fatigue. I mean, the number of people who, when I asked them, did they watch the debate, were like, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I can't deal with it anymore. I mean, I watched it, but I think that's legitimate. Like, I think it's just people, it's kind of toxic. And people are tired of it. So I think, and this is, by the way, not good for our democracy, people are checking out. They don't want to read another article or another essay or watch another battle with how awful things are. I think there's definitely a fatigue creeping in.
I would agree. I mean, I certainly feel it myself, and I know from conversations with other people, that subject comes up a lot. It's like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
to go through this. I'm wondering, do you? I'm not sure if this is something you've dived into or not, but do you get the sense that people in other countries are going through, have this sort of rural people are overlooked there versus people who live in cities, or is this sort of more of an American phenomenon, at least for right now?
Well, that's an excellent question. So as a social scientist, I always have to be careful to only talk about what I've actually looked at myself, cannot, you want to be really careful with the extrapolations. But I've actually had a couple of people comment that how I have documented what's going on in America, that one doctoral student actually at USC said to me, this is going on in India too, this exact phenomenon. And someone made the same observation about China. Now, I don't know. I haven't studied these countries, but it was interesting to see that there was that what I'm observing may be a social phenomenon at large rather than, US specific. I mean, I think we could pan out to what's gone on in the UK, what's gone on in France. There's no question that there is a real tension politically between extremes right now, that the US is not alone in that respect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, Before we need to run, I did want to kind of go back to a point you had made earlier about the role of education in all of this. And I guess I just find myself wondering, is it is it going to be possible to think for some of these, well, for lack of a better term, tensions to be resolved if people need to have a college degree to get ahead and have a middle class lifestyle, have a good job that enables them to live, buy a house, and do kind of what they would like to do. Because it seems like, at least up until recently anyway, if you didn't have at least a 4-year degree, you were going to get to a certain point, but your chances of getting beyond that were going to be kind of difficult unless you were really extremely ambitious and hard driving and all of that. Do you have the sense that we really are on a track where, without a college degree, people are just going to get stuck in some sort of mid to lower level economic status?
Look, that's an excellent question, and it's not my area of expertise, so I have to be careful here. I think it's both. So I think there's no question that a college degree offers you a much more straightforward line towards social mobility. It really does. It not just kind of puts you in position to take a job in kind of the knowledge economy, but it also provides you the ability to have options in that knowledge economy, which is different than if, say, you're working in a factory and the factory shuts down. What's the skill set you offer? Which is different if, like, you work in a publishing house and the publishing house closes down, but you have a degree in English, you could work for another publishing house, which is just down the road. Because, and also a lot of that, what I'm talking about, we see in cities, that kind of movement of the labor pools to different jobs, different industries come in and so forth. It's much more dynamic. That said, I do think, I mean, in reality, 35% of Americans have a bachelor's degree. So vast majority don't. And so I think there's a lot of jobs that people can have that don't require a bachelor's degree, but I really like the emphasis to be more on those trade and vocational jobs. They do pay well and they do involve skill. It's a different kind of skill, but it's really important. And it can be really important to local economies too, to become centers of certain kinds of crafts and manufacturing. And we need people who are doing that. Like, not everyone needs to program something. That's not how the world works. That's not how the United States works. We've had an increased resurgence in some manufacturing, small batch manufacturing that's happening in the United States. We still need people to fix plumbing and fix cars. I mean, that, again, I have to say, in my life, the plumber and the guy who can fix my car are way more important than the computer scientist. I mean, our day-to-day lives rely an awful lot on people who don't necessarily need a bachelor's degree. For me, the problem is that those jobs are not rewarded as well as they should be. They need to get better pay. And I think the same thing is true. And I think that what you're getting at, which is really important, and we see this a lot in cities, is that this kind of low skill service sector, that's where people don't make enough money to have any sort of social mobility. Because if you don't have a college degree, but you open your own plumbing business, that's fine. You're going to be able to buy your house and, get your kids through college if you want to. It's very different if you're working at the local grocery store for $15 an hour. Like, there's no social mobility to that. So I think that's the problem, is that those jobs, but they exist everywhere, by the way. I mean, that's not isolated to rural America. That's a problem in our cities as well.
And another fact, first of all, I absolutely agree with you, the importance of trades education. I mean, boy, around here, you want to get a carpenter, a plumber, an electrician to come to your house to fix something, good luck.
Yeah.
I mean, there just aren't very many, and they're all booked up for weeks or months. It's crazy. I guess I just wondered, one of the things here in Vermont that we are talking about a lot and have been for a while is what's sometimes referred to as the youth drain. A lot of young folks, they grow up here, they go to school here, and after they finish high school or college, they go to they go someplace else, usually a city somewhere. In your research, is this a pattern that you're seeing like across the country in rural states where a lot of the younger folks think, there's no opportunity for me here. I need to go to New York or Chicago or San Francisco or Los Angeles or someplace where there are more opportunities. Is that a phenomenon that's nationwide, or are we just sitting here in Vermont being worried about something that's unique to us?
Well, I didn't empirically track it, so I want to be careful. But it's interesting. I think two things are happening. I mean, one is you're right, people are leaving, people with ambitions that don't align with where they've grown up. Um, I would be an example of that myself. My mom said to me, I'm pretty sure when we moved to rural Pennsylvania, I knew you guys would leave. I knew your aspirations would take you elsewhere. And sometimes when I talk to my husband, he's English, I say, we got to stay in LA because I want to stay in a city where I know my kids are going to come home. So I think there is a truth to your observation. However, and by the way, and this is from some of the folks I interviewed, that there can be some pressure on folks to stay put, and there can be some concern about, one of the people I interviewed is a professor at Princeton, and he said, I had a wonderful student from West Virginia, and they said, she told me that her guidance counselor said, oh, if you go to Princeton, you'll never come back. And she was probably right. So there is that anxiety. But here's the thing, a lot of the people I talked to who lived in these small towns had a lot of family nearby, and they seemed really happy. And I think, I live in a city, and, we live and breathe this social mobility, your kids, where they're going to go to school, what's their hobbies, it's a pressure cooker. I think if you're not on that track, you might actually like your hometown and stay there, and mom's down the road and your sister grows up here, and mom takes care of the kids when you go work. That's really nice. And I don't think people underestimate that. I think that's a sticky factor that you don't have in a lot of big cities where people are transplants.
Well, it's like you say, the quality of life issue, in terms of quality of life, life in a small rural town is pretty okay in a lot of places.
Well,
And
I was going to say, I
so
bet you don't know the phrase toxic achievement, because that's like a word that's bandied about in my, mother parent school circles, because they talk about kids overachieving to the point it's like it's kind of toxic and mentally bad for them to be over, and I don't think that's a good thing, but that's the
oh,
pressure cooker of these global cities, and the kind of pressure to get into this university and be socially mobile in a particular kind of way. I don't think it's necessarily the best way. It's certainly not the only way.
yeah, no, not at all. Well, really, there's so much to talk about on this whole area. It's such an interesting subject, and one, of course, highly relevant to our times today and this year in particular.
Yeah.
But I guess we'll have to leave it there for today. I just want to thank you again, Professor Currid-Halkett, for your time, and sorry to ask so many questions that were kind of outside the area of expertise or whatever. But you clearly, you know, have a wide-ranging knowledge on all of this, and
Oh.
this was really quite fascinating and enjoyable. And once again, I'll recommend to our audience, if you haven't read it yet, worth a buy. Very good. All right. Well, thanks again, Professor Currid-Halkett. I do appreciate it. And do we have another book coming out soon?
We have another book idea coming out soon. So I'm finishing up some work on a fellowship I received last year. And so once I've finished that work and written it up, I'll start thinking about my next idea.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to that. Thank you
Thank you.
very
It
much
was a
again.
real pleasure. Thank you for having me on your program.
My pleasure. And thanks to all of you who have been with us today. Hope you found the program interesting, and well, we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, take care.